I guess. We are live. Oh, no, we're only in the test room right now.
No, I have said.
Oh, okay, then you should be able to see. I think you should be able to see stuff on YouTube that's, or maybe you need to, okay, yeah. Yeah.
So, playing the web race with my well, put it on stage, you're gonna work. So then you can do it on. Yeah, have this put it on. It's hard. I think one is. This is fire, which is. Was on the rear. All right, got it. You do it, but I'm not worried. You're nice. Here.
Okay, yeah, that's on. Okay, hello, good morning. Welcome everyone to Johns Hopkins. We are the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab. I'm Tim Sahai. I'm the co-director of the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab, and we've been housed in the Political Science Department at Johns Hopkins for the last 3 years. And with me today to talk about the Clean Industrial Capabilities Explorer that we're launching today is Bentley Allen, Professor of Political Science, and Shreyas Shende from our lab, who is leading our India work. Well, we are really excited to share the work that we've been doing, modeling and mapping clean industries globally and capabilities of countries globally over the last few years. This particular project, the Clean Industrial Capabilities Explorer, is a joint project with Data Wheel, and Gilberto is with us here today as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the lab and why we're choosing to launch today. This is right between a major shift in the world's attitudes towards industrial policy, towards climate change, and towards development. This is the last day of the UN climate conference at Belém, where green industrialization has increasingly become central to countries' climate goals and economic development. Next week begins the G20 in South Africa, where countries are also meeting to negotiate principles for global green industrial policy, making industrial policy extremely central to economic development at a time of a breakdown of global multilateralism. The lab has been working at precisely this intersection of climate and global development, and giving countries the tools necessary to design their industrial policies, integrating our sort of detailed knowledge of net zero supply chains, the very rapidly changing industrial policy landscape, and geopolitical dynamics. So the lab brings together capabilities in economics, political science, international relations, and engineering, so that we can map all of these shifting trends in policy, geopolitics, and technology. The lab does work, deep work in individual countries, not just mapping global trends. So we've been working with Mexico, Brazil, and India over the last couple of years. Before that, of course, we worked on US and Canadian industrial policy. And lastly, the lab has been working to develop some of those multilateral principles of global green industrial policy during a time when it is under deep contestation between trade wars and supply chain issues. Okay, so with that, I will hand it over to Bentley Allen, who co-runs the lab with me. Bentley is a professor at the Political Science Department at Johns Hopkins. His research brings together geopolitics, supply chain analysis, and policy development. And we will spend the next 20 minutes discussing the tool that we've put together, the Clean Industrial Capabilities Explorer, and then we'll have 20 minutes to discuss some of the case studies and listen to some of your questions about the tool. Bentley.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everybody for being with us today. So Shreyas and I are going to lead you through a live demonstration of the tool, the Clean Industrial Capabilities Explorer. And before I do that, I just want to say thank you to a number of people. First of all, thank you for everyone who came in person today on a Friday before Thanksgiving. We're so delighted to have you here. And thank you to everybody who's joining online as well. And I really have to thank Ishana Ratan and Benjamin Bagosi, who led the technical modeling underlying what you're about to see today, as well as the work of Becky Hahn and Jonas Goldman, who brought a lot of engineering expertise to bear on the model today. Catherine Goldberg rounds out the leadership team with Tim and I in the lab, and her work is indispensable to what we're doing. And then Pravina, Renato, Max, and Shreyas are the rest of our senior staff in the lab, and they've all worked on this model as well as its implications. Genevieve DeMai is here, and she's done a wonderful job on the communications for this event. And Tracy Biller in the political science department makes everything that we do possible. I also need to thank Yasmin Mozinia, Seema Paul, Robin Varghese, Laura Calvaro for their steadfast support, as well as Ben Schaefer and Steve Tellis for their early vision, and Robbie Shilliam for everything that he's done for the lab. And we also need to thank Adam Tooze, Chuck Sable, Peter Katzenstein, and many others who've served as intellectual mentors for us and for the work of the lab. What I want to really open with is just to say something very simple, which is that the world needs net zero industrial policy to succeed. This is a project. This is a new project. Applying industrial policy to the world of clean technology is something that we need in order to drive down the cost of technology, but also to build the political coalitions that are going to be necessary to sustain deep decarbonization all over the world. And we don't just need industrial policy in the established global economies, we need it all over the world, because every economy needs to build these political coalitions in order to successfully decarbonize and to seize the opportunities that the energy transition represents. So the tool really starts with this imperative. By 2035, the world is going to need at least 2.2 trillion in manufacturing and processing investment. So this is investment in the factories and the facilities that are needed to produce the technologies and materials that we need to build a net zero economy globally. And countries know this. They know that there are huge opportunities in this space, and they are designing green industrial policies in order to seize those opportunities. Those opportunities actually unfold across a wide variety of technology spaces. Solar, wind, and batteries get a lot of the attention, but manufacturing electrolyzers, producing heat pumps, producing permanent magnets, producing biofuels, nuclear, and as well as the grid equipment that we need in order to build out, not just for the clean energy transition, but for AI and for livability and prosperity all over the world. But often countries end up focusing on one or another of these, or everybody goes into the same areas. I remember in 2022 when everybody had a hydrogen strategy. And this is going to create a set of risks, right? The first risk is that the countries will go into places where they're not necessarily competitive, where their industrial capabilities or their manufacturing expertise is going to be ill-equipped in order to manage the rigors of a globally competitive industry. The other risk is that countries will all head into the same areas. For example, if everyone has a hydrogen strategy, then hydrogen will be overproduced. This will create problems both in the market for hydrogen, but it'll also do what, in fact, we already tried in the 1960s when the World Bank advised every economy in the world, not every economy in the world, but many economies in the world, to invest in coffee production. And of course, the price of coffee collapsed, and many of those investments in coffee production ended up being wasted. We want to be able to encourage countries to focus and build on their strengths, but also to diversify across all of the opportunity areas in the clean energy economy. And that's what our tool is really designed to do. It's designed to help countries identify where they might be able to build comparative advantage, but also to be able to identify where across all of the opportunity sets they might be able to focus their investment. And not just spreading across the 10 sectors that are in our model, but looking deeper. What part of the value chain for biofuels, what part of the value chain for batteries might this country be most equipped in order to contribute to? So the model requires us to get really granular, the imperatives of the world require us to get really granular. And the model is able to do that. Now, when we started out, what we did was we built a machine learning model on global data, mostly on global export data, but we also included a bunch of other indicators like patents and tariffs. And we looked at lots of things that we think would contribute to a country's competitiveness in each of these areas. But one of the things that really jumped out immediately, one of the key findings, is that actually competitiveness in each of these 9 areas is highly predicted by capabilities in just 5 core areas, okay? So these 5 core areas are electronics, machinery, industrial materials, metals, and chemicals. These 5 core capabilities form the basis of each of the clean energy technologies. And Shreyas, if you will, just take us through each of the technologies so that we can see that each technology has a unique profile. It has a unique combination of these capabilities. Now, this was not something we set out to find. It was something that the machine learning model that we built, an incredibly powerful tool built on a wide variety of data sources, just told us was true. It just told us that this was the case. So we weren't expecting to find this, but it was something that as soon as we saw it, we said that is something that is simple and true, and that the world needs to hear and that the world needs to understand in order to design better green industrial policies. So what the model enables us to do is take each technology, understand what industrial capabilities are needed to produce that technology, and then to identify which countries have the capabilities necessary to contribute to each of these technology value chains. Underlying the hood of the model is really a representation of the full value chain for each of these technologies. We look at the upstream materials that are necessary to go into the midstream components, and those components then go into downstream products. But we also look at the production equipment that is necessary in order to produce all of these technologies. So not just the actual components or pieces of the technology, but the capital goods that are necessary in order to build it. And this gives our model a little bit of a different basis than other models, because it's really rooted in the capabilities necessary in order to generate competitiveness. We can then see, looking across countries and looking across technologies, which countries are strong in the global manufacturing base of the present today. Obviously, China has a lot of strengths in our model and in the real world, but also India comes out as being a really interesting country to pay attention to. Brazil, a world-leading power in biofuels, also has a wind and battery industry that is burgeoning domestically, but isn't developing export competitiveness on top of that industry. Mexico's integration into North American supply chains has generated real strengths in a number of manufacturing areas, while South Africa is really still trying to get a foothold in critical sectors and industries. But let's take a little bit deeper dive into India as a case study here. India comes out very strong in terms of emerging markets and developing economies in the model. It's positioned 3rd in wind, 11th in solar. These are very strong positions. And further, we can dig deeper, though. We don't just have to stop at this top level, because the model is not saying that your current ranking is your destiny, right? The model is saying, this is where your competitiveness is today, but it provides you tools in order to create strategies in order to improve your competitiveness by opening up the industrial base, by opening up the capabilities and diving deeper. We can get a more granular image of what competitiveness looks like for each of these countries. So in the case of India, for example, India has a solar strategy. It boosted solar under the PLI, the Production Linked Incentive Industrial Strategy. That was in many ways considered to be a failure, or at least not a success. But the fact is that we found that actually the industrial capability for solar in India is quite strong. And those investments have started to generate real capability underneath the hood. Those capabilities in chemicals and metals are providing real strength for India. But it's going to need deeper investments in electronics and industrial materials if it wants to build its manufacturing base more broadly. And this is a critical general lesson of the model. It rewards countries that have made broad-based investments in their clean energy manufacturing base, rather than thinking about climate action or these clean energy value chains as somehow separate from the core manufacturing base of the world economy. Our model shows the integration between advanced manufacturing generally and the success and the performance of countries in clean energy value chains, showing a complementarity between investments in core pieces of the industrial base like critical minerals processing or chemicals capabilities and your ability to be competitive in clean energy value chains. This kind of continues a trend that I think really came out in Tim's comments, which is that we're not only trying to understand how climate action is necessary and how we can boost climate action qua climate action, right? But in a world in which it's harder and harder to say the word climate, let alone generate political will around the concept of climate, we can actually get amazing gains for climate action just by investing in the industrial base for manufacturing generally. That will drive down the costs and help build the political coalitions for climate technology for the next round, for the next time that climate becomes a major and important word in our global lexicon and in our global understanding. Let's go again to the last slide here. And we can see that the tool provides us with 3 views that are available today. We have a 4th view, the Value Chain Explorer, that's coming soon. And we'll be continuing to work with Gilberto and his team at Data Wheel to build out more functionality. We were saying, Tim and I were meeting with a colleague yesterday, and we said there's probably only about a 1/4 of the functionality or a 1/4 of the capability of our model that actually has made it into the website at this point, which means there's a lot more data and exploration for us to do. You've already seen a little preview of the competitiveness ranking, but let's just go in and look at the tool. What the tool enables us to do is create any class of countries that we want in order to create a comparative cohort. And you can use this view in order to put countries in comparative perspective. So Shreyas, just do me a favor here and let's just knock out a couple countries so that we have some room. And let's add Ethiopia and Slovakia, just for fun. We can also take a nomination from the audience if anybody has a country they'd really like to see. Poland. Okay, let's add Poland and Slovakia. So scroll down so that we can see the countries that we've just added here. Poland here and Slovakia are sitting right in the middle, and the tool automatically weights countries according to their average scores across them. So it produces a kind of ranking just from whatever cohort you've created. What's really interesting about Slovakia and Poland, and is something that tells us something about the way that the manufacturing base in the world is developing today. Basically, you can think about Germany as being a classic leading industrial economy in the world. And a lot of that manufacturing capacity is moving eastward as Eastern Europe builds up its industrial base. You can see this in Poland, and you can see this in Slovakia. You can see it in Czechia, in other parts of the former Czech Republic. You can also see it in Hungary. And each of these are also countries where foreign direct investment from China and other places are going rapidly because China has recognized that these countries have manufacturing capability and that they are places that can be competitive places where China can produce within the European Union and therefore have access to a very large market. Ethiopia is another interesting case. We're going to have to scroll all the way down to the bottom to see Ethiopia. But they actually do have, although these circles are small, these are good competitiveness scores. These are above the median, let's say, globally. Ethiopia is probably the most interesting case in the world today, certainly the most interesting case of a manufacturing economy in Africa, but potentially in the world, in part because they have just done a deal with China that whereby Ethiopia will put in place an internal combustion engine import ban. So you cannot import an internal combustion engine car into Ethiopia right now. And in exchange, the Chinese government has offered them a factory, basically, an EV assembly factory. It's not a factory in the classical sense that we would understand that term. It's China sends knockdown kits, which are then assembled in Ethiopia. But it allows the Ethiopian government to say to its people that we are assembling electric vehicles here in Ethiopia as a quid pro quo for this internal combustion engine ban. But the real reason why Ethiopia wants that internal combustion engine ban to be in place is not because it's pro-climate, but because its most expensive use of foreign currency is to import oil and gas. And that importing of oil and gas is just something that is expensive for a country that generates very few export dollars in a burgeoning manufacturing strategy, right? So Ethiopia's commitment to the energy transition doesn't hinge on whether or not it cares about climate, but it hinges on its manufacturing goals and its desire to produce itself as an autonomous, independent geopolitical entity in a world that is more competitive and dangerous than it used to be for countries like Ethiopia. There's more to the story in Ethiopia than that. They've had one of the most interesting and successful industrial strategies in Africa. They have specifically tried to leverage the Asian tiger strategy of getting a foothold in the textile industry and in other proto-manufacturing industries and climbing the ladder into capabilities there. And actually, our model is showing the success of that strategy. In transmission, in heat pumps, in biofuels, it's expertise actually in machinery and in metals that is producing those scores inside Ethiopia. So you can see our tool is showing the way that Ethiopia is getting itself onto the manufacturing ladder, the capabilities that it is producing in order to generate itself a foothold in the global manufacturing industrial base, where it hopes to continue to build on its strengths. Ethiopia's strategy in textiles has been so successful, it's deterred other countries that have had similar strategies to change their strategy. Rwanda was also developing a textile export strategy, but it basically has come to the conclusion that it's not going to be competitive with Ethiopia's textile strategy, in part because Ethiopia has such better logistics networks than Rwanda ever will, because Rwanda is landlocked. And therefore, Rwanda is trying to find another niche and trying to find other areas in its industrial strategy where it can be more successful. So these are just one set of storylines. I could give storylines like this all day long out of the Explorer. It's an incredibly rich tool. Let's look at the technology rankings here, Shreyas. So we already saw a view of this on the main page of the scroll. But if you scroll down here, you can see that each of the technologies, the top 20 countries for each of the technologies are ranked here. One of the interesting findings of the study is that basically there is variation in how concentrated each of the industries are. You can see in solar, the top 5 producers shouldn't surprise anybody, right? This is Chinese strength, Japanese legacy strength, spilling over into other Asian countries. But the top 5 and the high scores of the top 5 show that there's high concentration here, that it's going to be difficult for new countries to break into this as a competitive exporter of the final product. That doesn't mean countries can't find themselves a place in the value chain, but competitive producers of the final product are going to be few and far between. Let's look at a different technology here. Let's do magnets. Sure, magnets is great. Scroll down. You can see also very few countries actually producing in magnets. High concentration in which is something that we already know, but it also shows that it's going to be difficult for countries that already don't have a foothold in that East Asian value chain, or in Slovenia, which is again a really interesting case. One of the countries that in the policy brief accompanying our release today, we identify as a future star in the global economy, one of these few economies that there's not a lot of attention to right now, but are really turning into manufacturing powerhouses despite their small size. Let's look at something more broad-based like biofuels. So you can see in biofuels, there hasn't been a competitiveness edge really located by any particular country. You've got a lot of scores with a lot of countries with high scores, a lot of countries with high capabilities here, and which means that there's still room for countries to basically get a foothold in the industrial base for this technology. Again, just one set of storylines that we could pull out of this particular data view. Okay, let's go to the last view that's available today, which is a country industrial base. So we already had a preview of this when we were able to look at India and dive a little bit deeper into its solar. But let's click on solar for India and then scroll down where we can see a time series where we can see the evolution of competitiveness in India over time. Here you can see the payoff of the PLI in the rapid increase in India's competitiveness over the last couple of years. And so another thing that we can do with the Clean Industrial Competitiveness Capabilities Explorer is actually start to develop policy timelines and map them over the competitiveness timeline to get a sense of how policy is interacting with competitiveness. We've done some of this internal to the lab, but we're hoping by making the data available and public today, more people will be able to develop these case studies. And we'll have a whole bunch of these case studies identifying competitiveness coming out over the coming weeks. So I'll say again what I said at the beginning, which is that the world needs net zero policy to succeed. Countries need to be able to formulate granular strategies that are based on a legible and visible industrial base that they can build strategy on top of. We hope that the tool that we're introducing today, the Clean Industrial Capabilities Explorer, is a tool that countries can use as a strategic compass, which is to say that it's not a map. It doesn't tell us exactly the way that things are. It doesn't tell us the way that things must be, but rather it provides an orientation for them to engage in strategic action going in the future. So thank you again for your time today, and thank you for going on this journey with us. Thank you. So Tim is going to come back up, and Shreyas and Tim and I will have a little conversation, and there'll be room for all of you to have conversation with us as well. Thank you.
Terry, should we get question?
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. We're going to do a Q&A session, so please have some questions ready. And I'm going to just start off the team with just sort of a broad question. Big picture, what does the model tell us about opportunities in the clean energy economy?
Okay. So as you saw, the clean energy economy is growing. That's not coming directly from the model, but the fact that the model is swallowing up all of the production and export data. And basically, the total amount of investment in the clean energy economy has grown dramatically over the last decade, which has accounted for climate becoming increasingly central to countries' economic development plans, climate goals, competitiveness, national security. And so this has just generally been more and more important sort of focus for countries in their economic development. What the model is sort of telling you is that if you want to improve your position in clean technologies, you actually have to pay attention to just advanced manufacturing, because we are in the middle of a revolution in green industries, but also in digital technologies, automation, etc. So when you see the model telling you that electronics, for example, is an extremely important core capability for countries to enter almost any green industrial value chain, that's sort of telling you that there has been an underlying digital and ICT revolution over the last 30, 40 years. And if you have strong electronics capabilities, that is a launching pad to enter many clean industries. Particularly, you see electronics being extremely important for solar panels, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone because a solar panel is essentially a semiconductor sandwiched in glass. And so it gives us sort of lessons on how, instead of focusing entirely on sort of green and clean sectors, what you really need to focus on is your underlying foundations and underlying capabilities in those 5 sort of core sectors.
Yeah, I think that's so well put. What I would like to say is that many of the opportunities that countries have are likely to be more specific than they think of today, right? Countries tend to think of their opportunities in terms of solar or wind or whatever. But I think that the tool and the perspective that the tool embodies is saying that countries need to be more strategic and more focused than that, more targeted than that in terms of how they're thinking about industrial strategy. And really building those core capabilities underneath the hood will help them to get as granular as they need to be in order to actually generate competitiveness in these industries.
I would encourage folks in the room to sort of ask questions, but we also have questions coming in from Zoom. And Matthew is asking, is the model free access? And I want to add on to that question. And, we have a lot of folks from sort of research organizations here. Like, how would you expect a scholar or a firm or a policymaker to use this tool? And in what instances would their sort of usage and utility vary to these different stakeholders?
Yeah. Everything that's on the website is free access. So the website's available at I also forgot to say, very importantly, that we refer to the tool affectionately within the lab as CICE. So that is how you say the acronym officially. So CICE is available online. It's live right now. It's cice.netzeropolicylab.com. And the underlying data and the underlying model are not downloadable yet. We are working our way through the academic peer review process, and everything will have to be public as a part of that peer review process. So this is different than other tools that are out there in the sense that it's not proprietary and it's not going to be. It's going to be fully public and fully open source. And that's, of course, at the insistence of our philanthropic backers and our open attitude as an entity. So everything will be available in due course. Yeah, and as I said, we're going to get more functionality onto the website as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, we expect essentially everyone in the room and anyone who's listening online to be using the tool. So if you are working in a research outfit that is understanding any country's capabilities or economic development or climate action, you can use the tool to assess how countries have been doing over time. You can use the tool to compare and contrast countries. You can use the tool to write case studies for particular sectors, for particular countries. So there is a lot of work to be done to develop country level analyses, technology level analyses that we are conducting, and we're very happy to partner with as many of you as possible. And then we'll be doing a lot of engagement with the tool, where we have local partners that we've already developed in Brazil, India, and Mexico, but we're very keen to have these workshops where once you've identified a country's identified its priority sectors, say 3 to 5 sectors, firms and policymakers have to get together and have an open exchange of what are the problems and challenges and bottlenecks in each sector, which is sort of like a principle of doing good industrial policies, having open information flows between governments and firms. And if a government is like, we want to boost a particular sector, we have concentrated on, this part of the value chain, then you need to understand, is a firm capable of expanding its order books? Is a firm capable of suddenly increasing its supply? What does it need to do in that whole ecosystem? So these firms are also going to get a lot out of the tool if they are thinking about boosting their exports or their production. It allows you to figure out who else you need to talk to in an ecosystem to develop good industrial policy. So we expect researchers, government policymakers, and firms to all get a lot of use out of it.
Jump on that really quickly. I just want to underline this. I mean, industrial policy is not a desk activity. Industrial policy is a field activity. You actually just have to get out into the real world and talk to the firms if you're going to do industrial strategy. So the tool itself is completely insufficient as a tool, right? It will tell you where industrial policy can find joy, but it can't tell you what to do. You actually have to sit down with the chemical sector and say, how can this chemical sector in this country contribute to the solar industry? And something that we don't appreciate enough about what governments do when they do good industrial strategy is simply making those connections between firms, right? The Chicago School for many years told us that firms had perfect information about the world, but I'm here to tell you that firms are just populated by humans who only have a Rolodex. And that Rolodex can be expanded by governments convening different sectors and playing matchmakers between different parts of the economy. So one of the critical things that I think our tool can enable is for governments to say, you know what, we really want to have a better battery strategy. Here's where our capabilities are weak. Here's where our capabilities are strong. Where they are weak, let's sit down and have that sector table. Bring the battery firms together with the firms in the chemical sector and talk about what kinds of collaborations, what kinds of foreign direct investment, what kinds of policies would actually be necessary in order to strengthen the relationship between the chemicals industry and the battery industry, because that relationship is critical to competitiveness globally. So being able to have that conversation and being able to get that table together and form it in the right way, it seems like that's a small thing that the model can accomplish, but I'm telling you that's 9/10 of what good industrial strategy is.
Do we have any questions in the room? Great. Maybe we can take 2. Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
Please.
Yeah. Hello. Hi, my name is Carlos Guadarrama. I work at the World Bank on these topics, and I have a couple of questions regarding the model. The first one is related to the algorithm that you're using, because one of the latest papers from Hidalgo criticized many economic complexity models, saying that they were focusing just on the opportunities that the given country has without taking into account what other countries are doing, right? And you mentioned it in the beginning, if everybody starts producing solar PV, then the opportunity becomes less relevant. So does the model take into account this new, and this paper was written just this year, so does this take this type of algorithms into account? And the second is talking about comparative advantages. What's the comparative advantage of this model compared to Greenplexity from the Harvard Kennedy School? Because I understand that this focuses on the current opportunities, but for example, the Greenplexity also focuses on, or provides some guidance on future opportunities where they could actually invest their efforts. And the last one, what type of story does the model tell about Indonesia? Because for the longest time, people said, and policymakers said, Indonesia doesn't have the industrial capabilities, and it failed miserable having local content requirements for solar PV. But now we see that with the export ban, they're developing capabilities in EV manufacturing. So I'm curious about the story that the model tells. Thank you.
We're going to take one more question. If anyone else is, we have one, Tasi, and we had a question right there. Yeah.
Two questions for you. One is, can you say some, oh, my name is Lauren Seidner. I'm part of the MIT team here with my colleague, Rob. Well, I guess first question is, can you say something about the cadence of data updates, and will you be able to track over time kind of changes in rankings, and would you be able to sort of pinpoint what in the model, you know, how could you attribute that shift over time? And then second question is, did I understand correctly that the model does not take anything into account about the current policy landscape in a country? It doesn't sort of assume anything in terms of policy. Is that correct? And then if so, from a policymaker's perspective, like looking at this, if you were to see a large disconnect in kind of, you know, outcomes, production capacity, investment, where you did have a kind of considerable competitive advantage, how would you interpret that from a policymaker's perspective? Like, what should that tell a policymaker?
These are great questions. I think the short answer to your questions, Lauren, are that the policy overlay and the policy piece of this is our next step, and we're already funded to do that next step. But that's the next kind of modeling effort for us, is to really build a strong policy overlay on top of this. I will say that there are some things that are in the model already that I would think of as global policy. So for example, like tariff structures are already in the model, and so who's deploying tariffs and who's not deploying tariffs. And just one of the interesting things, and this gets to a little bit of what Carlos is asking about, what's under the hood. I mean, under the hood is a random forest machine learning model, which basically is just telling us what matters and what doesn't matter. The model is telling us whether or not policy is a major determinant of competitiveness. And basically, it doesn't seem like it is, actually. It seems like there's something deeper than current policy frameworks that are actually driving competitiveness for countries in the global economy. To Carlos, there's no dynamic interaction in the model. It's just a random forest that's built on, you know, a lot of regressions on the DV being export competitiveness. And so there's no dynamics yet. I would say, though, that the way that the model sorted itself out, if you want to put it that way, I don't want to put too much agency on the model, and certainly don't want to take any credit away from Ashana, who built it, is that it does have this future orientation built into it by the fact that it's really identifying a core set of capabilities. And we did that through the random forest by basically developing something which in technical terms is called the shop value. And you can read more about this on the working paper that is posted on the website this morning as well. So the full methodology is available on the academic working paper. And basically it tells us which of the exact data points did the model select for each country for each technology as being the key predictors. And so those radar plots are built on the model selecting whether policy was a key predictor, whether tariffs was a key predictor, or whether patent data was a key predictor, or whether it was actually some other product in the model that is the key predictor. So just as one point of comparison with complexity, you know, those key predictors are defined by distance, but in our case, the model is choosing what the key predictors are. So they're not kind of defined in advance. And that was something that was very important to me, was that intellectually, I did not want the model to decide. It wanted it to be inductive in that kind of core sense, which is to say that competitiveness is driven by the model rather than by my priors about what things should look like, right? And so the future orientation of the model is in some sense a product of the way that we set the model up in the first place in a technical sense, right? And Lauren, to your question, we have done a few experiments on the policy side. Just looking, for example, we were contracted by the Department of Energy through a grant at Hopkins to look at the wind industry in the United States. So we plotted competitiveness over time, and as I showed on the screen, you can see competitiveness under the hood evolving in each of these countries. One of the most interesting things in the U.S. industrial base for wind, and again, this is described in the brief. So today we're releasing two products along with the model. One is a policy brief, something written for lay people, and then there's the academic working paper. In the policy brief, we described the U.S. wind case, and basically it was very interesting because it was after the U.S. introduced tariffs that it got less competitive globally. And actually, this is consistent with my priors in terms of industrial strategy, in that the countries that have produced the best industrial strategies, such as South Korea, for example, were relatively open to the world in terms of competitiveness, allowing their domestic firms to have to compete with global benchmarked companies, ends up being a critical kind of policy determinant here, I think. And one that we saw in the US case, because once they put tariffs in place, they actually reduced their competitiveness. And we looked a little bit at the mechanism, and I think the mechanism there was basically that, those components from China in the wind supply chain that were coming into the United States were helping make the United States products cheaper, right? Which tells us something important about the tariffs that are hitting the economy today, as well as tells us something critical about the Biden era tariffs as well, right? That maybe we didn't have long enough to let the IRA go in its full sense, but that the late Biden administration move to backstop those IRA investments with tariffs, that's likely counterproductive. Anyway, we're going to do more work on these questions. That is, of course, the intent of the model, is basically to enable us to have a granular conversation about these policy initiatives, and that's where we're headed now. And we would love to collaborate and partner with folks on those studies.
I want to take a few questions from Zoom. We have quite a few questions asking to look under the hood, so to speak, sort of what are the inputs that you're considering. Friend of the lab, Isabel, is asking, can you clarify competitiveness estimates and how they're different from other methodologies that look at similar things? What is the state of the literature looking like, and how does CICE stack up? And at any point, will the model also consider the learning curve for technologies and try and incorporate that, right? Because you mentioned sort of the future-focused aspect of CICE, right? How are we going to build on this?
Just on the update cycle that you were asking about, so it's based upon the export data coming from the UN Comtrade. And we also have a separate model trained on the production domestic capacity, so the installed capacity, not just the export. So we are planning to, this one is up till 2023, but we'll probably have like an annual update cycle as soon as new export data goes to the UN Comtrade. We'll update the model as well. And then the model also has sort of technology. So each of the random forests is trained on a particular technology. And so we are planning to also do sort of technology deep dives, and then expansion of the model will be for next gen technology. So these are the 10 most the technologies that have seen the maximum investment in globally, but you'd expect the next gen technologies to start picking up as well. So that's sort of future work, and we are really looking forward to collaborate with experts to figure out new modeling methodology for next gen technologies, because you can't really use existing production, you can't really use existing exports. In many cases, the technologies don't even have HS codes given to them by the UN system because they're so new. So for example, when we were looking at Brazil, Brazil has this massive biofuel capacity, a predicted competitiveness coming from our model, but doesn't, the ability to make green jet fuel is clearly there. It has gotten a lot of investments from foreign technology providers into Brazil to do something with the ethanol capacity and turn it into advanced sustainable aviation fuels or green jet fuels. But green jet fuel doesn't have an HS code that is currently available. So clearly for countries, you do need to pay a lot of attention on things that a model is not currently doing, but are more sort of future facing. And I think it's Bill's question.
Yeah, the formal definition, the technical definition of competitiveness in ours is the likelihood that somebody would be ranked number one in that technology, in the export of that technology. So it's an export-oriented definition of competitiveness, which means it to get back to Carlos's point here, it does kind of have this interactivity built into it. I mean, part of the reason why we like trade data and part of the reason why Greenplexity and other tools in the space use trade data so well. And of course, we can't forget Penny Mealy's work, which has been foundational for us and really influential on us. And one of the things that we're going to do immediately is something that Penny and Sam did in their last paper, which is basically just lag that RCA increase to show where there's momentum. And that's something that we're going to learn from methodologically because we think that's a great trick. But on the competitiveness point, the formal definition is the likelihood that somebody would be ranked number one. And I think what's really value added about our approach is not the definition of competitiveness, not the use of export data or the focus on that. I think those things are strengths of the model, but other models do that. But it is this finding that there are 5 core capabilities in the economy that really drive competitiveness in each of these clean energy value chains. And the map that produces for us, both in terms of how countries can engage in strategy, but also how the global industrial base for clean energy is evolving. Max has been doing some excellent work in the lab on trying to understand these patterns, which you can find in the policy brief. But just to give you a kind of an example of it, one of the claims that we think is most interesting coming out of this and will be the foundation of a future working paper is that it's really Asian investment in chemical capabilities that has given it the edge in clean energy value chains. Whereas Europe's legacy strength is actually coming more out of its legacy in machineries and metals that is really driving their competitiveness in most of these value chains. So there are some aggregate patterns that we can see that help us to think deeply about the structure of the global manufacturing economy as it's evolving. And not just the structure, but also how we can build strategy on top of that and how countries can situate themselves within these overall regional and historical legacy patterns. So yeah, I think the model is really rich in its ability to drive us to a new way of understanding the global industrial base. And that's why we put that concept of the industrial base at the center of our work. And because we really thought that in order to understand the clean energy transition, we have to grapple with this question of what the industrial base looks like. And so while the tool provides a top line competitiveness number, it's that ability to unpack that number and to see insight that is really distinctive, I think, about our approach.
Gilberto
has the mic.
Yeah.
Sorry. Gilberto Garcia from DataWheel. I'm just wondering in the pipeline, that things that you want to continue exploring during in the model, are you planning to break it to the value chains embedded on those products? I'm just thinking that, that will suggest some points of entry that are specific to the specific countries.
Yes, that is the exact next thing that I have asked the data team to work on is basically instead of treating the final product as being the dependent variable, so instead of predicting competitiveness in your ability to produce a solar module, make each of the stops along the value chain to be the dependent variable. So therefore make polysilicon, who's competitive for polysilicon, who's competitive for a nacelle in the wind turbine, who's competitive to make anode or cathode in the battery value chain. So The only complication with that is where we have good trade data going back far enough, because many of these codes only enter into the trade data more recently. And so there's going to be more noise in the data there. But we actually think that, and we're still working on an inference strategy here, but we actually think that, again, the way that we've set this up in terms of capabilities provides us for a way to use the historic trade data that then gets broken up in an innovative way that will enable us to speak to that over time. So that's the very next thing. In terms of getting data on the website, one thing that's not there is that in the country radars, for example, so there's the technology radars. The technology radars tell us which products could you export that would make you more competitive for solar or wind or biofuels. The country radars say, well, what did India export that made it more competitive for solar? And that data is not on the website yet. So we'll be coming back to you guys shortly and try to figure out a way to get this data about exactly what it is inside each country that makes it competitive, get that information publicly available. So that's another kind of critical thing. And then the other big thing that we're going to be doing is expanding the suite of technologies. So we were already kind of insane, and we tried to do 12, and 2 of them broke. So we had to cut it down to 10. But we were also insane in that we promised the funders that we were going to do 20. And so, but the next 10 are going to be future technologies. So instead, trying to build things like solid state batteries, new forms of permanent magnets. And so we have to develop an inference strategy that will require a different modeling approach in order to get to these future technologies, because they don't exist. And so we can't do a historic analysis of 20 years of exporting that product. But we're really excited to tackle that problem as well.
We'll do a last set of questions for within the room.
Great, thank you all. This was, I can see how powerful a tool this is. As somebody who studies geopolitics, industrial policy, I'm looking forward to poking around, especially the geographic story that you highlighted. I'm going to ask 2 questions. The first one is geopolitical. Since this data is really about exports and comparative advantages, in a sense, it's also presuming a relatively open trade system, which right now is being called under question. I'm not questioning that premise, but for people who are interested in or advocates for industrial policy, what does this model or what does the finding show us to tell policymakers or stakeholders about these sorts of investments when certain supply chains are being securitized, regulatory environments for upstream or midstream products are going to be prohibitive in the future, potentially. Not necessarily for big countries, but for the smaller countries or the mid-sized countries that seem most vulnerable to this current geopolitical moment. And the second one, since you've both teased this a little bit, is when we talk about industrial policy, a lot of this is about material capabilities. But technology and human capital, education, R&D, labor policy, these are all also important in determining comparative advantages, especially for upstart countries or countries seeking to leapfrog. So how does, you mentioned, Bentley, that you're looking at these future technologies. How does that soft part of industrial policy factor into how you're making these sorts of predictions going forward?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm Maida. I work at ORF America. It's a think tank in Washington, D.C. I could already see how helpful this tool can be in drafting some of our policy briefs. And I have a question about what you said earlier about UN Comtrade data. It aggregates a few exports, and so I was wondering how you navigated that to specific exports that you were looking at for the clean energy value chains. And does the competitiveness kind of include integration and interconnection of new capacity as like a competitive value in the model? Because I think like in the United States, and I also work in India, so there are very long queues for interconnections. And so I wonder if that's something that's being taken into account. Thank you.
I'll just sort of take the industrial policy sort of requires a lot of openness. But at the same time, countries are passing both tariffs and local content restrictions to develop national production capacity. And local content restrictions are, they're both political and economic in nature. Politically, you want to create winners and domestic benefits in jobs and firms in a local supply chain. But at the same time, you need to be importing intermediate components in order to finish them. So there is this inherent tension between trade policy and domestic industrial policy, and countries have to navigate that tension. And they might navigate that tension in a different way depending upon their current comparative advantage in a particular sector. So if you are highly competitive in a sector, you're probably looking for a more open system, right? And so, you can sort of see that play out in countries' tariff policies. When they move towards a more dominant position in a sector, they tend to lower trade barriers. When they are very early stage, they might be increasing sort of infant industry sort of trade barriers. So we are sort of open and flexible to how countries sort of think about their policy mixes to develop a sector, but you really have to do that in a detailed sort of sectoral country by country sort of way. But the broad picture of, you need a lot of intermediate components to be flowing across borders. And in a generalized world of sort of tariff wars and trade uncertainty, almost every firm is just not investing until there is more certainty. So that you can sort of you can already see in a lot of trade data of 2024, 2025, which is not in the model yet.
Yeah, we can connect offline about how we handle the data under the hood, which if you've worked with it at that level of detail, you know the complexities and the difficulties there. We don't deal with interconnection queues per se. I think that it's interesting also, we really wanted to be able to tackle the question of which countries were successfully producing clean power, but that's going to be a different kind of modeling approach. Didn't end up being part of this one, mainly because we wanted a class of technologies that were highly comparable with one another, that were really classic value chains with manufacturing as being the goal here. What I would say to Darcy's great question is that I think we don't know how much economic nationalism is going to actually generate in terms of a closure of trade, right? It hasn't shown up yet, right? We've been doing a little bit of this since COVID, and global trade has not shrank, right? Maybe the growth rate of global trade has contracted just a little bit, maybe just a little bit below global GDP. Which means that it's shrinking in absolute terms, or shrinking in relative terms rather, even though it's growing in absolute terms. But we'll see whether or not actually countries really turn inward in any kind of fundamental sense. I still think that technology now is so complex, and I think this also gets to the knowledge question in a kind of oblique way. Although here, I'm borrowing all of my insight from Cesar and Gilberto and the work that you folks do on knowledge and capabilities. I think that knowledge and that capability is so regional but so transnational at this point that it's going to be incredibly difficult for any country to really build competitiveness in these highly complex technologies if they are not open to the flows of knowledge, right? And that I do not think that publics will stand for having second-class technology compared to peers in the global sphere, right? And that's ultimately what we would be saying if we thought that a world could become more closed fundamentally, right? Is that some publics would accept second best AI or driving crappy cars or et cetera, right? I think that the technology frontier is going to be highly visible and even more visible as we move into the future, right? So everyone's going to know exactly what the technology frontier looks like. And the drive for that will push countries into openness in some fundamental way, right? We've seen the inability of the US to restrict the flow of semiconductors just as one key point, right? And if you put every single tool of the US national security state at your disposal and you still didn't restrict the flow of NVIDIA chips to China, like, are you going to be able to restrict the flow of electric vehicles or electrolyzers or biofuel catalyst plates? I don't think so. I think that the world economy has a kind of force to it that has to be reckoned with, and that countries have to take it seriously if they ultimately want to produce prosperity for their people.
Maybe one last question. We had quite a few folks on Zoom sort of ask this big picture question. So, for instance, by heavily subsidizing rooftop solar, Germany was able to achieve sort of a lot of lessons learned for deployment, despite the fact that, Germany does not feature particularly high on our ranking, right? Like this gap between the reality, what national policies are pursued, and sort of what our model says. What is the bridge between that, and what is that bridge meant to tell us, right? Like when you say that this is about potential opportunities, if you could speak on that.
I think what countries should be thinking about is where they can produce productivity gains and where they can produce innovative and dynamic clusters that will build on their existing strengths, but that will push them into the future, right? The goal of industrial policy should not be to have a lot of subsidies in an industry forever, right? The goal of industrial policy should be to produce a globally competitive industry that can stand on its own. I think that in the case of Germany, for instance, I think that Germany did the world a service by basically driving deployment and helping China achieve scale in the middle of the solar value chain, right? It paid a heavy price for that. I think it's still paying a heavy price for that, right? And one of the biggest questions in the world today is what's going to happen to the German manufacturing base. I think this is, I mean, I can't, it's like one of the top 5 questions, I think, in terms of determining the future of geopolitics is how that cashes out. And the solar, the bleeding out of the solar sector in Germany and the bleeding out of the wind sector in Germany is a critical piece of that story, right? Did Germany come out on top? I mean, they still ultimately made themselves dependent on Russian gas over that same period where they learned these so-called deployment lessons, right? So I just think geostrategically, there's a more complex story from the perspective of Germany. And I think that the opportunity question is the more interesting one, I think, in terms of designing areas of focus where countries will be able to compete is going to require them to think hard about where innovation and productivity can actually be generated in sustainable places. I think if you look at Japan, although Japan comes out so strong in our model, right? And if you look at the different countries that responded to the Inflation Reduction Act globally, and almost every country did kind of develop some kind of strategic response to the manufacturing push that the Inflation Reduction Act represented. Japan's is by far the most interesting, but they only put $8.8 billion on the table. But the Economic and Security Promotion Act inside Japan is probably one of the most interesting and compelling industrial strategies that has been developed globally since the Inflation Reduction Act, and has the smallest price tag, right? And that, I think, says 2 things. One, it's that Japan prizes coordination, focus, and discipline over everything else in an industrial strategy. And 2, that they know that their industries are already competitive, and that if they just induce more discipline, focus, and strategic engagement, then they can actually still compete, right? And I think that is a kind of North Star that countries can think about, more so than can we put big subsidies on the table, right? And in a fiscally constrained world, we don't need to be focusing on big subsidies, but we do need to be focusing on strategic focus and discipline. And I think that, yeah, I mean, the tool is meant to intervene in this broader international conversation that we're having.
If you don't have any more questions, the team will be hanging out for a bit so we can take the conversation there. But thank you everyone for turning up here, and those who are watching us online on Zoom and YouTube. And thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Shreyas. Thank you all for coming.